Hello, my name is Akshaya Ramamudan, and I will be presenting our work titled Influence Dynamics Among Narratives, a case study of the Venezuelan presidential crisis. My co-authors are Shi Zhang, Ji Yasong, Dr. Stephen Fiore, and Dr. Georgios Anagnostopoulos. The Venezuelan presidential crisis began in January of 2019 after a widely disputed election. Prior works have established that Twitter was heavily employed during this time. It functioned as an effective tool for political communication and therefore, naturally, competing opinions. So within this context, we're concerned with how narratives evolve. Narratives here are defined as a consistent point of view messaging, such as anti-vax messaging, for example. So more specifically, we want to evaluate how different narratives influence each other through these discussions. The objective of this work is to comprehend the underlying inter- and intranarrative influence structure. We also want to see how these influences change with the progression of the crisis. One of the primary challenges here is the sheer volume of data that renders determination of causal relationships based on content quite difficult. The outcomes of this work are as follows. First, we provide an interpretable and unambiguous indicator of inter- and intranarrative causal influences. This is done via process influence measures that is in turn achieved by modeling Twitter messaging as a multivariate point process. Second, we are able to interpret co-evolving influences along narratives under the prism of greater causality. Our results indicate strong influences may be attributed to landmark events. Causal relationships, if they exist, can be extracted. And finally, we're able to provide social scientists and analysts in the intelligence gathering community with a tool to better understand sociopolitical phenomena. So as mentioned earlier, our goal is to evaluate these influences during the Venezuelan presidential crisis. But this crisis began on the 10th of January 2019 after the inauguration of Nicolas Maduro. This was following a widely disputed election held during the May of 2018. This was further escalated after Juan Guaido, then president of the National Assembly, declared himself as the interim president. Twitter data during this time period involved both domestic and international participation, as was evident with the international outcry and reaction to this crisis. Countries took sides along historical lines. US, for instance, sided with Guaido, who represented an ideological opposite to Maduro, whilst Russia and China favored Maduro. The event count histogram on the right shows an increase in the count of events on the 20th of January, which coincides with when thousands of Venezuelans in over 12 states demonstrated in support of Guaido and called for a transitional government. The data we used was obtained by a third-party data provider. There are over 7 million tweets between the 25th of December and the 1st of February, with about 1.2 million unique users. Each tweet was labeled with potentially multiple narratives. The tweets were also labeled with stances, that is pro or anti-Maduro. We only used the narratives present in at least 100,000 tweets, which resulted in about 8 narratives, which are listed in the legend to the figure. The annotation effort has been carried out by the data provider. The procedure used is as follows. First, the relevant topics were obtained using non-negative matrix factorization. These topics were then forwarded to the subject matter experts who used these topics to generate narrative labels. So these narrative labels were then used to manually annotate a subset of the entire data set, which is about 11,000 tweets. So these manually annotated tweets were used to train a BERT-based multilingual caged multi-label classification model, and was used to label the rest of the tweets. So some high-level observations about the narratives themselves, whose details are shown in the table. These include the fact that tweets about protests and the military dominate since they are central to the crisis. Moreover, narratives such as protests, assembly, and arrests are determined to be strongly anti-Maduro. This high-level analysis supports the idea that Twitter messaging has been more favorable towards quantitative. So moving on to our methodology. For the purpose of modeling process dynamics, we use a stochastic temporal point process. A point process can be thought of as a random set of ordered event timestamps. We use a specific kind of process, namely the multivariate Hawkes process, which has been used in a wide variety of prior works for modeling social media dynamics. This process consists of a system of self and mutually exciting Hawkes processes. Point processes are uniquely identified by the conditional intensity function, which is defined as the expected increase in the event count within an infinitesimal time window. So there are three components to the conditional intensity of the Hawkes process. The base intensity, which accounts for any background and unaccounted for influences, the process, followed by self and mutual excitation terms for inter and intranarrative influences. Finally, the parameters to be learned, AII and alpha ij, are strictly positive. And these model parameters are estimated by a constrained maximum likelihood. Finally, one of the key assumptions that we make is, one of the key implicit assumptions is that each event generated is attributed to a single cause. And this will be illustrated in the following slide. So here we have a video to illustrate how new events affect the intensity function. For this example, we've used a predefined Hawkes process with fixed parameters. The video shows how the intensity function changes as new events come in. An additional facet of these models is how they're able to capture parental relationships. For instance, the first event of the first process is the parent to the first event of the second process. And this is evident in the fact that the first event contributes to the intensity function of the second process. Therefore, knowing the shape of these functions can inform us as to who the most likely parent is. And in fact, we take advantage of this for devising our proposed measure. Okay, now on to determining Granger causality. So what is Granger causality? Granger causality is predictive in the sense that it pertains to functional dependencies, often correlations between stochastic processes. This is true with all other predictive causality assessments. That is, if there is a causal relationship, it will manifest itself as a functional dependency between the processes. Therefore, these relationships can be discovered. The contrapositive is true as well. That is, a lack of a functional dependence implies a lack of causal relationship. Subject matter experts can then come into the picture to verify such claims of causality. In the realm of point processes, such a causality is established if the learned parameters are greater than 0. Now, Granger causality has a binary outcome, and we seek to evaluate the strength of these influences. Also, the alpha values by themselves are insufficient to convey the strength. So to remedy this, we introduce process influence measures, or PIMs, to provide an interpretable representation of inter and intranarrative influence. It's simply a ratio of the contribution of each event type to the intensity function. So what we do is we identify for each event the narrative that is the most likely theorized cause via this expression. We then estimate the probability that events of narrative J influence events of narrative I by obtaining the frequency counts over all of the events for a narrative. The expression shown is for influence between narratives, but a similar expression can be used to evaluate the influence of base. So moving on to our experimental setup, we trained a multivariate Hawkes process on overlapping 2-day windows across the 1-month time period. An additional benefit of point processes is that we can perform goodness of fit tests to see how well the trained model fits the data. This is based on the fact that transforming the times via the integral of the intensity function must belong to an exponential distribution with unit rate. And the figure below shows how good of a fit the trained model is to the data. So having trained each model, We then obtained PIM heat maps for these time windows. The figure to the right shows the heat map for a January 12 to 13 time period. The rows indicate the narratives being influenced. For instance, in the third row, we see that Guaido legitimate is being influenced by military, Guaido legitimate, and Maduro legitimate. The overarching trend was self-excitation, with some notable exceptions that we cover in the upcoming slides. Another observation that stands out is that Maduro legitimate is never influenced by any other narrative. So this figure is intended to collect all influences that stand out with respect to the trend of self-excitation. Tweets about assembly seem to be influenced by a wide variety of narratives, which goes on to show how central the National Assembly was to the crisis as a whole. We also notice that between the 6th and the 10th of January, self-excitation is dominant. Finally, we notice a strong influence from arrests to protests during the 14th to 15th January time window. This occurred the day after Guaido was arrested, although briefly by the Bolivarian intelligence service. On the right, we'll see a video that shows these PIMs changing over the duration of the data set, which is roughly a month. We go on to list some of the other influences that can be linked to landmark events during the crisis. I do want to point out that a landmark event might be a possible factor that initiated this cross-narrative influence. Due to the fact that we deal with observational data, subject matter experts would have to investigate these time periods further to ascertain the exact cause of this apparent cross-narrative influence. So going into the specific dates, between the 25th and the 26th of December, we observed that anti-socialism strongly influences Guaido legitimate. This occurred before the crisis began and could indicate international support towards Guaido, since he stands ideologically opposed to Maduro. Between the 11th and 12th of January, Maduro legitimate significantly influences Guaido legitimate, during which period the first open cabildo, or political action convention, was held. Between the 12th and 13th, Maduro legitimate influences Guaido legitimate, which coincided with Guaido's arrest. Following this, on the 14th to the 15th of January, arrests decisively influenced protests. Between the 20th and 21st of January, military significantly influenced protests. This can be attributed to when military members rose up against Maduro, which was then followed by widespread protests across the country. Finally, between the 24th and 25th of January, anti-socialism significantly affects military. This is in the wake of protests calling for the military to relinquish allegiance to Maduro. So to conclude, we here presented a tool for exploratory analysis of co-evolving narrative influences using point processes. We proposed PIMs as an interpretable and unambiguous representation of influences for point processes. And additionally, we illustrated its use in the case of the Venezuelan presidential crisis. We provide a path for social scientists and analysts to filter out time periods of interest to carry out further investigations. Our results indicate that landmark events could potentially trigger these cross-narrative influences, paving the way for future work. These are our references. And finally, we would like to acknowledge that this work was done under DARPA's computational simulation of online social behavior, or social sim program. Any opinion, finding, conclusions contained within this presentation are entirely of the authors and do not reflect that of DARPA or the US government. We would also like to acknowledge Grant Sanderson, the author of the Python package that was used to create the animation. Thank you for your time, and you can visit our YouTube channel for previous work and more exciting upcoming works. If there are any questions or comments, please feel free to leave a comment down there.